Making it very clear they're not going to ask.
And Vicky, I'm going to stop you. Here's Matt Hancock. Briefing. I'm joined today by Baroness Dido Harding, the Executive Chair of NHS Test and Trace. Before we start, I want to recognise the sad loss of Dame Vera Lynn. She united us in the worst crisis that this country faced, and ever since she's inspired us all with the words that she will always be associated with: "We will meet again." And we send our condolences to her family, and we will all remember her warmly. The first thing I want to do is take you through the latest data and then talk about progress with NHS Test and Trace and vaccines. If we go to the first slide, please. The first slide shows that yesterday there were 136,516 tests, taking the total to over 7.25 million tests in total, and that there were 1,218 positive test results. If we go to the next slide. This slide shows the estimated average number of people who had Covid-19 in England. This is according to the ONS survey. And as you can see, the number has been coming down over time. And this same survey implies around 4,500 new cases per day. Next slide, please. Data from hospitals also shows that broad downward direction. There are 490 admissions with Covid-19 on the 15th of June. And as we can see, the number of people on mechanical ventilator beds is now 360. Next slide, please. The number of people in hospital continues to come down in almost every region. You can see a very small uptick in the east of England, but as you can see from the charts, there's some movement in the variation in each of the lines, and the overall movement continues to be down, and overall down to 5,193 from 5,863 this time last week. And the final slide of this group, please. When it comes to the number of people who've sadly died with coronavirus, yesterday the number of deaths reported was 135, bringing the total to 42,288. And again, we can see the downward trajectory, thankfully, of that number. And the number 135 is lower than this time last week, but there is still some way to go. There's one additional report that's worth looking at, which is that Public Health England today published their weekly surveillance report, which shows that last week, for the first week since mid-March, the number of people who died in this country in total from coronavirus and anything else was no higher than is normal at this time of year. So that demonstrates that the number of deaths is coming right down. But the battle against this virus is not over. And it's a battle on many fronts. And there's two areas I want to update you on today. The first is vaccines. And before I talk about corona vaccines, I just want to mention a very important reminder about other routine vaccines that are there to protect you. Throughout the crisis, we've tried to keep the vaccination programs for children going, and that has been largely successful. But if you or your child is invited for a vaccination, like MMR, then please make sure you attend. It's very important that we don't fall behind on the vaccinations for other diseases because of this crisis. During the pandemic, we've put the stringent measures in place to protect people who are getting vaccinations. And in the long run, the best way to defeat this virus is, of course, the discovery of a vaccine. And since the start, we've been supporting the most promising projects. As of this week, the Imperial vaccine is now in the first phase of human clinical trials, and AstraZeneca has struck a deal for the manufacture of the Oxford vaccine. They're starting manufacturing now, even ahead of approval, so we can build up a stockpile and be ready should it be clinically approved. Just like with dexamethasone, the treatment, which we stockpiled before we had proof that it was clinically effective. So we are starting the manufacture of the Oxford vaccine now so that it'll be ready should the science come off. Today we have also published the way in which we propose to prioritise people for access to a vaccine as soon as one comes available. Just as we did for testing, we'll be guided by the clinical science, prioritising those in most need. I'm very grateful to the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, which has published its interim advice today. They recommend priority vaccination for two groups: frontline health and social care workers and those at increased risk of serious disease and death from coronavirus, including, for example, adults over the age of 50 and those with heart and kidney disease. As we learn more about the virus, we'll continue to take into account which groups may be particularly vulnerable, including, for example, those from ethnic minority backgrounds, so we can protect the most at risk first should a vaccine become available and get this country back on our feet as soon as we possibly can. Our approach to vaccines is to throw everything at it as fast as we can and rigorously to test and make sure that they're safe before deployment. This is our approach across the board, in fact, including on test and trace too, and that's the second area that I want to focus on today. Baroness Harding will talk you through the latest figures from our NHS test and trace programme shortly. Today's data show a system that is working well and constantly improving. And remember that each one of the thousands of people who are now isolating because of the NHS Test and Trace programme and all the work of those involved is someone who would have been innocently going about their daily lives not knowing that they were a risk to their community. And as you may remember, our plan is to complement this human contact tracing with a contact tracing app. Like other governments around the world, we've been working hard on this, and I want to be upfront and open about the challenges that we and other countries are facing. Over the past few weeks, we have rigorously tested our prototype app in the Isle of Wight and in field trials, and I want to thank everyone who's been involved and all the islanders of the Isle of Wight, the council, who've been brilliant, the local NHS, and Bob Seeley, the MP, who has played a real leadership role. Thank you. Because of this testing, we discovered a technical barrier that every other country building their own app is also now hitting. We found that our app works well on Android devices, but Apple's software prevents iPhones being used effectively for contact tracing unless you're using Apple's own technology. After we started our work on our app, Google and Apple then started working on their own product. And as soon as they did this, we began working on both. We kept our options open in the same way that we do with other areas. And I personally feel in this fight, more than any other, that we must leave no stone unturned. So I asked Dido and the NHS X team to make sure that they worked on both products. Of course, we've been testing Google and Apple's product too. And as we did this, we've found that it does not estimate distance well enough. Measuring distance, of course, is mission critical to any contact tracing app. So as it stands, our app won't work because Apple won't change their system, but it can measure distance, and their app can't measure distance well enough to a standard that we are satisfied with. Throughout this, for me, what matters is what works, because what works will save lives. And I will work with anyone, public or private sector, here or overseas, to gain any inch of ground against this disease. So we've agreed to join forces with Google and Apple to bring the best bits of both systems together. We'll share our algorithm and the work that we've done on distance calculation and combine that with their work to deliver a new solution. I've always been optimistic about the contribution that technology can make in this battle against coronavirus. And coming together in this way will bring together some of the best minds to find a solution to this global challenge and help to save lives. In the meantime, the NHS test and trace system, based on good old-fashioned human contact tracing, is working well, identifying local outbreaks and helping to control this virus. And I want to ask you all once more, if you get a call or a message from NHS Test and Trace, the most important thing is please do your bit to protect your community, to protect your loved ones, and to protect the NHS, and follow those instructions. I'd now like to hand over to Baroness Harding to take us through the test and tracing stats.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Could I have the slide, please? As the figures show, in the second week of the programme, 5,949 people who had tested positive for coronavirus had their details transferred to the contact tracing system. Of those people, 4,366, that's 73% of the total, were reached and asked to provide details of their recent close contacts. That's a small increase from 72% in the first week of operation. And similar to what we saw last week, it's very encouraging that 78% gave us this information within 24 hours of being asked to do so. We really appreciate and recognise everyone's swift response. Using that information, as you can see on the next slide, we were able to identify 44,895 people who had been in close contact with someone who tested positive. Of those, 40,690 people were advised to self-isolate, which is 91% of all the contacts identified. This is very similar to what we saw in the first week of operation, and again, this was done within good time. These statistics are encouraging. They demonstrate that we're making progress against a good starting point we outlined last week. Last time I spoke to you, I made a commitment that NHS Test and Trace would keep learning, improving and refining to become a high-quality service that all of us can depend on. In partnership with Public Health England and local government, we are right now protecting local communities from outbreaks. I'd also like to outline some of the steps we've taken that set us on that journey of continuous improvement. Firstly, we've changed the process of requesting tests. We've taken out the need to copy a 16-digit code between websites when a test is booked to make it easier for us, for all of us. Secondly, we're changing how our labs operate. We're changing shift patterns so that some labs are working overnight and some are working weekends to match when samples arrive for testing. And thirdly, we've connected people's test results to their GP records. And these improvements will continue. We will continue to work towards an app which forms part of the end-to-end service of NHS Test and Trace and enables people to engage with every aspect of the service. And I'd like to reiterate everything that the Secretary of State has just said in thanking the people who have been involved in developing and trialling the app to date, and in particular, the people of the Isle of Wight. We are truly grateful for your support. Finally, I'd like to take a step back from some of our operational changes and show you what NHS Test and Trace should mean to you if you ever need to use it. And I can't do this any better than by reading the words of one of our brilliant clinical contact tracers who shared their experience of contacting a lady who had tested positive for coronavirus and was nervous about what it meant for her and her family. In their words, she needed to hear a professional, calm and caring voice who was there to listen, advise and support. She needed to be reassured and hear that she was doing a great job caring for her daughter. And after we had finished, she told me that I'd made her burden feel lighter and that she wished we could speak every day. I've said before that NHS Test and Trace is a service for the public that works best as a partnership with the public. And to me, the work of our contact tracers shows us what a true partnership looks like. I want people to know that NHS Test and Trace will be there for them when they need it. And I want to reiterate what I said last week. If you have symptoms, a fever, a new continuous cough, or a loss or change in your sense of smell or taste, then testing is available. You can and must book yourself a test. If one of your children has a fever, stay at home and order a test. If NHS Test and Trace gets in touch with you to say you've tested positive, you should go online or call us on 119 if you don't have the internet and provide us with accurate, up-to-date information about your recent close contacts. And if you're one of those contacts, it's vitally important that you do what tens of thousands of others are already doing and self-isolate. Because in doing so, you will be taking the virus out of circulation. You'll be protecting your friends, your family, and the wider community from infection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness Harding. We'll now go to questions from the public and then to questions from the media thereafter. So the first question is from Luke in Cardiff by video.
Hello, good evening. Every year, thousands of students from different areas of the country come together in one place to start the university year. How is the government supporting universities and local councils to ensure that the influx of students in one town or city doesn't result in a local outbreak of the virus? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Luke. That is a great question. And of course, the work is ongoing now, led by the Department for Education, to make sure that we can do as much as we can to ensure a safe restart of universities in the same way that we're working towards the safe restart of schools in the autumn. And that's incredibly important work, both in terms of what happens inside the institution, but also, exactly as you say, when people go to university, they usually travel. And places like Cardiff, which of course has a brilliant university, in fact two, there are many students who go there. It's a really important point. It's something that the DFE is working very hard on. Thanks very much for your question, Luke. The next question is from Stuart in Birmingham. And Stuart asks, as a large number of people have been working from home during the lockdown period, is the government planning to pass laws that will make it easier for employees who wish to continue working from home to do so as lockdown is eased? Well, the number one thing I'd say, Stuart, is that working from home is absolutely recommended wherever it's possible. Of course, there are some industries in which it's just not possible, some jobs. But wherever it's possible, we recommend working from home. I think one of the big things that people have learnt from this crisis is the opportunity of working from home and how it can be effective. And thank goodness the technology is now readily available to make that so. So it's certainly something that I think will stay with us a long time after the crisis. Those Zoom calls or other technologies are available. I'm very happy to talk to the business department to ask whether there's laws that need to change given that big change in how people are using technology. I think we should take that away and look at it. But the best thing is, in the first instance, of course, people can work from home. Where people can work from home, they should do so, and businesses, employers should facilitate that. Thanks very much, Stuart. Great question. The next question is from Hugh Pym of the BBC. Hugh.
Thank you very much. You had said that the smartphone app would play a central role in testing and tracing. It's now been delayed. When do you think the app will be involved in identifying and tracing contacts?
Well, thanks, Hugh. We are working on it, is the answer. We're not going to put a date on it, I'm afraid, because I'm absolutely determined that whilst this technology can help, it's got to be working effectively. And the central point of test and trace is actually the fact that when you are identified as at risk, you then isolate, and asking people to isolate for 2 weeks is a big thing. And so I would not recommend an app unless I'm confident in it. I've explained, I hope, why the best parts of the two systems that we've been working on can be brought together. But I am confident that we will get there. We will put that cherry on Dido's cake.
A quick follow-up on another subject, if I may.
Sure.
More than 2 million people are shielding, and there have been reports in the last day or two about the scheme coming to an end at the end of July, based, it seems, on briefings to charities. Can you end the uncertainty and give people in that situation a proper indication of what is going to happen?
Well, Hugh, I know how sensitive this is to the 2.2 million people who are shielding and their families, and we've asked them to do something which is really, really big over the last 3 months, which is to stay at home almost entirely. Until recently, we put forward the clinical advice that it's okay to go out very carefully to exercise. We will be bringing forward the next steps very, very soon. But I don't want to go into any more detail because I want that to be done properly, and I want it to be done with the support of the charities who do so much to support those 2.2 million people. And so there will be a formal government publication, and we will write to every single member of that group to make sure that they know what it means for them. In the meantime, the advice remains to keep shielding, and the current programme and the end date of the programme is, of course, the end of this month. But before then, everybody will get an individualised letter from the NHS to explain what they need to do next. Thanks very much, Hugh. The next question is from Tom Clark of ITV. Tom.
Hello, Secretary of State. Thank you. First, a question for Baroness Harding, if I may, about test and trace. We just heard there from the Secretary of State about 4,500 people a week are estimated to be a day are estimated to be getting coronavirus in the community. A rough calculation suggests about 10,000 symptomatic people a week could be out there in the population. Yet you're testing just a fraction of that are actually getting through to test and trace. If you're missing so many people who are symptomatic for COVID and getting tested, how can we be sure that test and trace can stay on top of outbreaks?
Dido.
So, thank you, Tom. There are two things that we need to do, and one of those things is for all of us. So, we are missing some people who have symptoms who are not getting tested. And so all of us have got to learn this new behaviour, that if we have a temperature, if we have a continuous cough, or we lose our sense of taste or smell, the first thing we should do is stay at home, and the second thing is we should order a test. So that's why you've heard me say this from this podium this weekend, last week. There's something for all of us to do. If one of our children, and young children get temperatures all the time, and it's a new behaviour. If one of your children has a fever overnight, you stay at home with the family, look after them and order a test. The second thing we have to do is get better at hunting out the virus. 70% or so of people who have the virus won't show any symptoms, or will have such mild symptoms they might not spot it. And that's why we're doing targeted testing for people in high contact professions, such as health and social care, but also other roles. We're looking to expand that. So there's more work for NHS Test and Trace to do. So perversely, I'm one of the very few people working in government that wants to see the number of people testing positive go up each day, because it means that we will have a more targeted and efficient testing system. But obviously, we also want fewer people to get the virus. So I'm not pretending that it is perfect. Of course it isn't. We all have work to do to keep honing it and improving it.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks very much. Can I just follow up with one more for you Secretary of State? The system isn't perfect. We've just heard that from Baroness Harding. We have those continuing to ease lockdown measures. Could that explain why we are seeing, in that PhD data that you mentioned earlier, an increase in outbreaks in schools, in hospitals, in other settings compared to during the lockdown period? How do you explain that?
Well, the good thing is that we're seeing a reduction in the number of people dying from coronavirus, and indeed a reduction in the number of people dying overall. So that there are now actually just slightly fewer people dying in the last week's data than in a normal June week in a normal year. It's statistically equivalent, those two data points. We are doing much more to be able to trace these individual outbreaks. For instance, there's an outbreak right now in parts of Leicester that we're working very hard to track down, and we're putting in a mobile testing unit, and we're working hard on that. There's another in Kirklees in Yorkshire, again, we've sent in mobile testing units. We're working with, in both cases, the local council, and in both cases, the local director of public health is doing a magnificent job working with the NHS Test and Trace scheme and the Joint Biosecurity Centre as our sort of our eyes and ears. So there are these local outbreaks. We've seen them all the way through, and we now have the system in place to be able to spot them as best we can and then take that local action. And it's natural that as you lift as the lockdown lifts slightly, we've always said the next move is to more localized action in order to tackle outbreaks where we find them. Dido, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I would just say that we have a very large-scale test and tracing service up and running now. If you look at the scale of our national service in terms of tests conducted per 100,000 of population, in terms of contact tracers per 100,000 population, it stands comparison with anyone in the world. So we have a service that is fit for purpose for as we stand now, and it will get better and better with each passing week.
Thanks, Tom. The next question is from Andy Bell from Channel 5 News. Andy.
Thank you very much. A question for both of you. The app has been described as the cherry on the cake as there seem to be more and more problems developing with it. It's much more than that, isn't it, if we're ever going to go back to normal? Because it's all very well for people to have contact tracing. They can remember the people that they knew, that they were in touch with it. But if we're going to get back to normal and people are standing in bus queues or getting on trains, they're not going to know who those people are. So an app is absolutely vital, isn't it, to get back to any kind of normality?
Well, the thing that's vital to get back to the sort of normality you describe is to get the number of infections right down and to have the treatments and the vaccine available and to have a world-class test and trace system as a whole. And actually, one of the things that we've learned from the Isle of Wight is the importance of the human in the contact tracing, and that the app is an important addition, exactly as you described. For instance, somebody sitting on the bus that you wouldn't know and therefore be able to pass the contacts on. But the core is the human contact tracing element of it, and so that's But we still want the app to work. That's why we backed both horses. And we'll keep working with all the technologists to get one that does. Dido.
I'd just add that this is a global challenge. That what we've done in really rigorously testing both our own Covid-19 app and the Google Apple version is demonstrate that none of them are working sufficiently well enough to actually be reliable to determine whether any of us should self-isolate for 2 weeks. That's true across the world. And yet, a number of countries, including ourselves, have got scale and effective test and trace services. I think clearly having an app that can help identify people you don't know would be a hugely helpful addition to those of us that commute. But there are other things we can all do. Good hand hygiene, being really aware of social distancing, wearing a face mask on public transport, all of those things are well within our abilities now. And I do think what we are building is fundamentally a human, local community service that will be digitally assisted. That technology on its own isn't going to solve this. It's all of us in the way that we behave that will.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes, of course.
But if you don't have a date and you can't give us a date for when this app will be ready, and there's been discussion even today of it being autumn/winter before an app is up and running in the way that it needs to be, that basically means, can we get back to normal life in terms of people getting on commuter trains, etc., before autumn/winter? That's an awful long way away.
Well, I'd simply say, Andy, that the core of the NHS Test and Trace programme is to ask people who are high risk to isolate. And as you've seen in the statistics that Dido's just shown, that now covers 87,000 people. And so there's a very significant operation in place. Of course, it can be enhanced. Both the human side will continue to improve, as we've always said, and adding the technology. But I absolutely don't put the direct link that you do between the two. But we'll get the app up and running as soon as we can. But I will not recommend people to download the app until I'm confident that that's the right thing to do, because I'd be asking people to download the app and then to self-isolate if it tells you to, and that is a big thing to ask of people. And so you'll understand why, rather than just putting this out, even though there are these problems with it, I'd far rather not. I'd far rather get it right. Thanks very much, Andy. Next question is from Heather Stewart of The Guardian. Heather, how are you?
I'm very well. So there have been reports of problems with the app for weeks now with the NHS version. Australia announced on the 6th of May that it was switching to a Google Apple approach because it realised that it wasn't working, developing a bespoke app. Has it taken us too long to realise that this is not something that we can do ourselves? And is that because we were too fixated on being world-beating?
No, actually, quite the contrary, Heather. I'm from Newmarket. We backed both horses. So we took the decision in May to start building the Google Apple version as well. And then because we'd built both, we could then test both. And actually, the best way to get new technology going is to test different approaches. And this often happens as a standard approach in the commercial world, for instance, and far better to go with both versions. And we've now got problems with both versions, but there's parts of each that can come together to build something that's stronger than either version there is. Dido?
The reality is, if we hadn't backed both horses, we wouldn't have a way forward. Precisely because we've developed our own and we've developed some really sophisticated distance calculations, we think that we can enhance the Google Apple platform such that it will work. If we hadn't backed both, we wouldn't be able to do that.
Thanks, Heather. The next question is from Matt Dathan at The Sun. Matt.
Thank you. This week we've seen more evidence of how disabled children, their families and adults with learning difficulties have been left behind and let down in lockdown. This week, a survey by the Disabled Children's Partnership found 3/4 of disabled children have had all of their support withdrawn, such as respite care and equipment. And this leaves also a huge strain on their families, their siblings, their parents, and adults with learning difficulties, many of whom live in supported living situations. Like my sister Beth, actually, herself, they want much clearer guidance to help them adjust to the new normal. And they also want to know when they'll be able to see family again. So what measures can the government take going forward to ensure that people with disabilities are no longer forgotten during this pandemic?
Well, Matt, I think that's an incredibly important question, and I've seen the report, and I saw the report in The Sun on this earlier this week. It's an incredibly important question. I think the first thing to say is that even whilst almost all children weren't going to school during the lockdown, we kept 80% of schools open for those with special needs. We have put more support in from central government, including, for instance, the 10 million Family Fund Trust. But it's vital that local authority support that you refer to is also there. And getting that into place as services recover right across the board is incredibly important.
Well, one thing that might help with this is maybe following Northern Ireland's lead, as we hear today. Schools are going to be reducing social distancing to 1 metre. Why is it so different here? Why can't schools here reduce the social distancing to 1 metre when they reopen in September?
Well, we're working on what is needed to get schools open in September, to get all schools open in September. And there is a review, as you know, Matt, into the current 2 metre rule. But the 2 metre rule is itself a social distancing measure. So removing it has an impact in terms of the transmission of the disease. So we have to make sure in that review that we have the space within and the viruses under control enough to be able to make the change and to replace the 2 metre rule, if that's the conclusion of the review, with something that then makes it easier to do things like, for instance, have people together at school. So I get the interaction between the 2 metre rule and getting people back to school. We're working very hard now, the DFE is leading it, on the work that's needed in order to have all pupils back in school, as everybody wants to see, from the start of September.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on, you didn't quite answer when we might be able to actually visit family and stay overnight. You know, Father's Day on Sunday. Can you give us any hope of when we might be able to start seeing our parents or going to stay overnight?
Look, that is another one of the social distancing measures that we're looking at. Of course, we're looking at it. It's an important consideration, not least because I want people to be able also to have a holiday, if at all possible, this summer. And the rules currently prevent people from staying elsewhere overnight unless they have exceptional circumstances. So that is something that we're looking at, and we'll work on it, and I'll make sure that you know about the outcome of that just as soon as we possibly can. Thanks, Matt. Final question is from Jerry Scott from the Yorkshire Post. Jerry.
Thank you. I'd like to ask how local leaders are supposed to be ready for these local lockdowns we've heard about. We've got directors of public health saying that they don't know what the term means. We've got mayors and council leaders saying that they don't have the powers to enact them on a scale larger than one building. And the Joint Biosecurity Centre won't be fully operational until later in the summer. So what happens in the meantime? Or are you moving away from the term, as you've just spoken about the outbreak in Yorkshire and said you've put mobile testing in, so our local lockdown's no longer on the table?
Oh yes, the system is already up and running. In fact, I chaired a meeting this morning of our local action committee, which is the formal process through which we make these decisions, working with local leaders. For instance, in Kirklees, as you mentioned, the local director of public health and the council are heavily involved in the response. There are actions and powers that people have at a local level in local councils, and then there's powers that I have as Secretary of State from the Coronavirus Act, and we have a process so that if on the ground they need powers that I have, they can put that request up and we can look at that. And similarly, if we spot a problem, then we can go down to the council and ask what they're doing about it. So that process is in place. And it's up and running and working. And Dido were sat around a table for an hour this morning working on exactly that, including discussing Kirklees. Dido.
I would add that it is a good Yorkshireman, Tom Reardon, the Chief Executive of Leeds City Council, that is leading this work for the Secretary of State and I, and making sure the government has allocated an additional £300 million to upper tier local authorities to build and enhance their local action plans. And what we're seeing is that communities are doing this now as we speak in a number of places across the country, where we see experts from the Public Health England health protection teams working alongside directors of public health in local authorities. We from NHS Test and Trace are able to allocate out mobile testing units when they need it, to use our contact tracing capacity to do extra contact tracing, and then to work with employers and individuals so that they can take the necessary social distancing, deep cleaning, health protection measures. So there is a lot of work for everyone to do as we all get used to living with COVID. But actually, I think that I really firmly believe that the way to do this is through local communities working together, and that's what Tom and his team are doing.
Thanks very much indeed.
Sorry, can I just have a follow-up?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Sorry, that doesn't change the fact that the mayors and council leaders and directors of public health locally across the country are saying they don't actually understand what this is, and they don't feel they have the powers, even if you say they do. So do you feel like you've communicated that well enough to them, and will you issue further guidance?
Well, the local directors of public health who have the statutory responsibility locally in this area are the ones who we directly engage with. Of course, where there is a local outbreak, the whole council, including the council leader, the council chief executive, will inevitably get involved if it's significant. But I do think that led by Tom Reardon, who himself is a chief executive of a Yorkshire council in Leeds, we're getting better and better engagement with each local area. And as I said, you can see it on the ground from the example in Kirklees right now. But of course that can, there's more and more councils that we need to engage. But thankfully, in most areas, this isn't necessary. Where it's necessary is where the outbreaks are, and thankfully at the moment they are relatively few. But of course, we work intensively whenever we see one. Thanks very much indeed. That brings to the end our daily coronavirus briefing. Thank you.
See the headlines as they happen and watch BBC News live in the app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.